Good morning and welcome. This is 10 years hence. Our guest speaker this morning comes to us from Charlotte, Vermont. Jeffery Hollander is the co-founder and former president and CEO of Seventh Generation, the leading brand of natural household products in the United States. The company's brand name products include paper towels, bathroom and facial tissue, napkins, and paper plates made from 100% recycled fiber and manufactured without the use of chlorine bleach. Cleaning and laundry products that are renewable resource-based, phosphate-free, and biodegradable, and natural baby diapers and wipes. The company markets and distributes to natural food stores, supermarkets, mass merchandisers, and mail-order catalogs in the United States and Canada. Mr. Hollander is a member and former director of the Social Venture Network, a group of socially conscious business executives. He co-founded and was a director of Community Capital Bank, a New York financial institution that invests in affordable housing and community development. He has served as a board member and advisor to numerous organizations and is focused on socially responsible business practices. Mr. Hollander recently co-founded the American Sustainable Business Council, a progressive alternative to the Chamber of Commerce that currently has over 50,000 members. He serves on the board of directors of Greenpeace US, Verite, a leading international advocate of workers' rights, Vermont Business for Social Responsibility, the Environmental Health Fund, and Alloy Incorporated, a publicly traded company. Mr. Hollander has worked with some of the nation's largest businesses in their efforts to become more sustainable and responsible, including Walmart, Microsoft, and Kimberly-Clark. His writing frequently appears in a wide variety of publications ranging from the Harvard Business Review to Strategy and Business, the Huffington Post, and greenbiz.com. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please help me welcome Jeffery Hollander.
Morning. Can everyone hear okay? Yeah, back there? Good. Well, thanks for coming to listen to me today. I'm going to talk about three things. I'm going to just tell you a little bit about, not that you haven't already heard enough about me, but I'm going to give you a little more context about my own history. Talk a bit about the current situation we're in from a business and an economic perspective, particularly focusing on some of the challenges that we're facing, and then talk about some potential solutions. As you listen to me, I hope you will think about challenging and difficult questions that I haven't addressed, places where you might disagree with me, challenges that you want to make to the argument that I'm going to present to you. So, as you heard, I am an entrepreneur. I have been an entrepreneur for pretty much my entire life. I dropped out of college after a year and a half and started my first business, and Seventh Generation is the third company that I have started. Well, you heard about Seventh Generation's products. I didn't start Seventh Generation because I wanted to sell toilet paper or laundry detergent. I started Seventh Generation because I wanted to help create a different type of business. Back when Seventh Generation, is that buzzing? Is that okay? Back when Seventh Generation was started, Ben & Jerry's, The Body Shop, Patagonia, there was a whole group of companies that were beginning to rethink the role that business played in society. And my interest was much more in that than it was in selling environmental products. The things that were important to me and the things that we focused on at Seventh Generation were what is an ethical role for business to play in society? what is sustainability as it pertains to corporations, have a great concern about employee ownership. As I'll talk about today, I think one of the biggest challenges we face in our economy is that we have too many employees and not enough owners. Pay equality was very important. You know, we live in a world where CEOs typically make 500 times the lowest paid person in the company. I think that's wrong. I don't think it's justified. I don't think it's ethical. And I limited my salary to 17 times what the lowest paid person at the company made. And I can tell you that you pay a lot more attention to what the lowest paid person is making when you're limiting your salary to a much more narrow ratio. Focused a lot on radical transparency. Radical transparency is not talking about the company and all of the good things that the company's doing. If you read, how many of you read corporate responsibility reports? Not a lot. Well, you're not missing all that much. But, you know, corporate responsibility reports, which are an important discipline for companies, are really often marketing pieces that talk about all the good things that the company's doing. Radical transparency is telling the public what they want to know, answering the questions that they have, answering and talking about what the business has done wrong, where the business is falling short, as well as what the business is doing right. That is a painfully difficult thing for business to do. Business does not generally like to be self-critical. So, after 23 years at Seventh Generation, and I did, I would say, relatively well for the investors of the company when back in 2000 the stock was trading at $1.75. When I stepped down as CEO in 2008, the stock was worth $22.50. So, you know, that's a pretty significant appreciation for the shareholders. But sadly, about 6 months ago, even when I stepped down as the CEO, I continued to work full-time for the company. The board of the company and I had a parting of the ways, and I was fired from the company about 6 months ago, largely over issues of value, largely over issues that relate to employee ownership, transparency, and what it means to be a sustainable business. And as happens in a lot of companies, as you grow, you take in more and more venture capital and private equity, and often those investors have a different perspective on what you should be doing than I did. As you also heard, I live in a world of what I call irreconcilable differences. I work and have worked with companies like Walmart while I sit on the board of Greenpeace. And I think that it is in that intersection that some of the most interesting things happen. And, you know, a lot of people take sides and say, you know, these people are right and these people are wrong, but I find it's often most interesting to try to reconcile differences that often seem irreconcilable. So let me shift now and talk a little bit about the context that we're in through the lens of business and the economy. And I would say that we are in a difficult place. There was a study that was done by Strategy One, which is a division of Edelman, in December of 2010. And the public said that 6 in 10 corporations didn't meet their expectations in 2010. 7 in 10 say business needs to do better this year. 82% of the public assigned business a grade of C or below, with 40% of the public giving business a D or an F. 88% of the public believes that corporations have recovered from the recession better than they have. And that's not particularly new news. If you go back to the times of Enron and WorldCom, I think business has been walking down a path that has increasingly disenchanted the public. And there's some very specific reasons for that. One of the reasons is that in the third quarter of 2010, corporate profits were the highest they have ever been in 60 years. Now, you might wonder how that's possible when we have such incredibly high rates of unemployment. You know, what's going on in the economy? Companies are incredibly profitable, but people are out of work. Well, those two things are integrally related. In many ways, business likes high unemployment. The fewer workers that business can use to get the job done, the more profitable they often are. We live in a country where 1% of the population owns 50% of the wealth. And the average income for the wealthiest Americans grew from $4 million in '74 to $35 million in '07. America is now a more unequal society than Egypt, Yemen, Tunisia. I don't think that's a good thing. I think that's actually dangerous for our society, but I think it's also dangerous for business. I don't think that we can be successful as businesses when we have a wealth situation that becomes so stratified. And as we're seeing in Madison, Wisconsin, and all over Wisconsin in the past few days, the trend, as perhaps you can tell, I have a particular perspective from a political point of view, but I don't think that reducing incomes of people that are working in labor unions is a good thing. And I think that it continues this polarization of wealth that's bad for business. And we risk disruption to our society when we create a society that is so unequal. And while you hear about 9% unemployment, if you include people that have stopped looking for work, people that are unemployed, what's called the broader U6 measure of unemployment, unemployment is now around 17%. And if you happen to be African American without a high school education, you have a 42% level of unemployment. So, one more statistic, 1 in 7 Americans are today using food stamps. And we sit here, and I must say I spend a lot of time in very comfortable places. This is a beautiful auditorium. It's easy to forget how challenging times are for a lot of Americans. Often it is out of our sight, out of our view, out of our consciousness, but it is a dangerous trend, not just from a political and a social perspective, but it's a dangerous trend from a business perspective. So many people, me included, have pinned their hopes on this whole notion of corporate responsibility and good companies, sustainable companies, and yet we face some challenges. Probably about 99 out of 100 companies that start down this path end up being sold to large multinationals. If you walk into a natural food store, whether you purchase Ben & Jerry's ice cream, which is part of Unilever, or Stonyfield yogurt, which is part of Danone, almost all of the brands that we associate with natural and organic are today part of multinational companies. Now, the question is that a good thing or a bad thing? In some respects, it's a good thing because distribution increases and their products are more widely available. But I think that that comes with a price. It comes with the tendency to export jobs out of the United States. It comes with a tendency, when Unilever bought Ben & Jerry's, they couldn't let any employees go for 24 months. 24 months, almost to the day, they let 20% of the employees go. So there are some negative tendencies that come along with the ownership of these very large companies. But There are also some wonderful companies that have succeeded and stayed independent. Organic Valley, which is a $500 million company and is structured as a cooperative, so it can't be taken over by anybody else. They have been incredibly successful, and I think that the ownership structure of the company matters a lot. Another example is W.L. Gore, which is a privately held company. So one of the things that we need to pay more attention to, and then I want to talk a little bit about, is when we talk about corporate responsibility, we talk about sustainability, we're often very focused on the products that the company is selling. We have to pay as much attention to the ownership and organizational structure as we do to the products that are being sold. And I know some of you were probably here to hear J. Cone Gilbert talk about B corporations. How many people were here for that talk? So a lot of you. So you heard a lot about how important the ownership and the corporate structure is, and it's something that doesn't get enough attention, but it's critically important. So, one of my reflections as I move on from Seventh Generation is that Seventh Generation was great at being an exception to the rules. Seventh Generation showed that it was possible to do a lot of things that other companies said it was not possible to do. The big argument about limiting CEO pay is that you can't attract talent. Well, that's just not true, although a lot of people argue that that is a restraint on the growth of the company, and it's important to prove that's not true. But at the end of the day, while Seventh Generation was an exception to the rules, I came away from that experience thinking that rather than being an exception to the rules, we actually have to change the rules so that all companies are sustainable, all companies are responsible, all companies behave more ethically. And one of the challenges that we face is that we've created a system of incentives, a system of taxes, a system of regulations that actually encourage businesses to behave in the wrong way. Now, if we take an example, let's take organic agriculture. You have one company growing organic tomatoes or organic lettuce, and they are taking care not to pollute the groundwater. They're taking care not to expose their employees to toxic chemicals. They're making sure that they don't create a lot of soil erosion and that the chemicals they're using don't wash off their land into local streams and rivers. Who pays for most of those negative externalities? Who pays when groundwater is polluted? Who pays when the air is polluted and when the soil is eroded? We as a society pay for those negative costs, and thus, because we don't charge the business who has those negative impacts with the economic cost of the damage they do, it's more profitable to not worry about those things and let society take responsibility. So if you're an organic farmer and you're employing some of those practices, which sometimes cost more money, your product ends up costing more than the traditional product. As a toilet paper salesman selling recycled toilet paper, the government spends $1 billion a year subsidizing virgin timber, which means that the cost of recycled fiber is artificially higher than the cost of virgin fiber. And it sends a message to consumers, which is confusing. They think, well, you're pulling this stuff out of the garbage. Shouldn't your product be cheaper than someone has to go cut down trees and turn those trees into pulp? But what they don't realize is that the government is subsidizing that and not subsidizing the recycled fiber. So I don't, as much as sometimes I sound angry at businesses that do bad things, I think that we have to pay attention to the system that we've created. We have a system that pays huge amounts of subsidies and tax breaks to the oil, gas, and coal industry. Billions of dollars. Exxon, as of 2 years ago, even though they were making $1 billion a week profit, was getting $1 billion a month in subsidies from the U.S. government. Now, that creates a distorted playing field. If you're in the solar business, I don't know whether people read about America's third largest manufacturer of solar panels in Massachusetts. They picked their business up and moved to China because they said that the economic environment in the U.S. is too tough for them to compete. The Chinese government provides them with incentives, and they moved their whole business to China. Now, when you have unemployment, when you have global warming, when you need to build an energy economy that's not dependent on non-renewable resources, we can't afford to have American businesses pack up and move to China. Now, part of that is because, unlike the U.S., the Chinese government spends as much money investing in alternative energy in 1 month as the U.S. government does in an entire year. So you have to look often not at the behavior of an individual business, why they're doing what they're doing. You have to look at the system that underlies and drives their behavior. And my conclusion is that if we're going to get ourselves headed on a better path, we have to deal with the underlying system. And I could talk on and on for a long time about that. I'm going to check the time and see how I'm doing. But it is, how many people are familiar with the notion of full cost accounting? Okay, so we need to add a course on full cost accounting, because full cost accounting is the notion that all products and services should embody all of the costs, including the environmental impact, the social impact. And if we had full cost accounting, bad products would be expensive and good products would be cheap. Today, it's just the other way around. People sometimes don't want to buy green products because they're so expensive, and they shouldn't be. They should be cheaper than other products. So, let me move on. Before I move, we'll take the questions later. So, let me move on and talk a little bit about some of the solutions that I think will address these challenges. And I have skimmed the surface in talking about a very complicated set of challenges that we face. And just one last comment on that. You know, the other thing that I think is confusing to people is not just are corporate profits high, but they watch the stock market going up and up and up. And it gives us a sense that, well, things are returning to normal, things are okay. And I think that again, is a false sense of security. As an investor, am very leery of the stock market. And I think that we will see not just social unrest, but we're beginning to see real disruption from an environmental perspective. It's really interesting when you think about the companies that were the most concerned about global warming the earliest. Which sector in our economy do you think was most alarmed about global warming the earliest? Anybody have an idea? Sorry? Insurance. Jesus, no one ever gets that right, and you are completely right. It's the insurance industry, because the insurance industry understood that global warming would make it too expensive for them to operate. They could never charge enough in premiums to cover the damage that would come from the environment. And, you know, in Europe, there are certain insurance companies that won't provide insurance if the board of directors of the company doesn't sign a commitment to deal proactively with their CO2 emissions to slow down the rate of global warming. But you're the first person who ever got that right. Good for this school. Let me move on to talk about solutions, and I feel like I've done a very superficial job talking about the challenges, but we can address those more if you have questions later. So, you know, one of the challenges that you have when you're thinking about, well, you know, how do you fix such a hugely complicated problem? we're talking about the economy, we're talking about unemployment, we're talking about the environment. You know, there's a wonderful professor at MIT. You had Peter Senge come and speak to you, who is a very close friend. He wrote the introduction to my book, The Responsibility Revolution. And Peter and Otto talk about something called acupuncture points. Where are the places you can focus your energy that send the widest positive ripples of change out? Because you can't attack everything at once. So I want to talk about what I think are some of those acupuncture points. And, even though I sound often critical and negative and cynical, the good news is that we have the capability, the technology, the know-how to address all of the problems we're facing. The challenge isn't, are we able? The challenge is, are we willing? Will we make the commitment to do that? So, the first place I'll start, and did Peter, when Peter Senge was here, did he talk to you about systems thinking? Not much. Well, shame on him. Because Peter Senge is one of the world's most brilliant systems thinkers. And in addition to full cost accounting, when people ask me if I could change something about the world, what would it be? I would teach every kid in first grade systems thinking. Systems thinking is a very different way of looking at the world. We've created a world of specialists. You're an accountant, you're a lawyer, you're a biologist, you're a geologist, and you see the world through a very narrow lens. That is an increasingly dangerous thing because all of these things are interconnected. When someone says ethanol is this is probably a dangerous thing to say in this part of the country, but when someone says ethanol is a great idea because it is, energy made from vegetables, what could be better than energy made from vegetables? If you were a systems thinker and you started to ask questions and you asked, well, how much energy does it take to create the energy that comes out? When you add up the energy used to make the fertilizers and everything else that goes into growing the corn, what you discover is there is almost as much energy used to make ethanol as is produced by ethanol. And thus, it's not a wonderful environmental solution. You also have to ask the question, in a world where there are food shortages, should we be using a food source that people could consume as an energy source, or should we be using something else? So systems thinking is the process of looking at the world through a wider lens, looking at all the unintended consequences for what we're doing, and the interrelationships that are often outside of our view. Another example, people think about global warming as an environmental issue. Global warming is not an environmental issue. Global warming is as much a health issue as it is an environmental issue. We think about changing weather patterns and storms and hurricanes, but when the temperature rises in one part of the world, what will happen is that diseases like malaria that we've spent decades trying to wipe out will all of a sudden start to reappear in other parts of the climate where the globe has become warmer. And there are hundreds of implications for global warming. There are implications for business supply chains that will be disrupted. And again, when we want to understand, and I'm on the board of Greenpeace, and Greenpeace's #1 priority is to deal with global warming. And I sit there in the board meetings and say, we got to talk about economics, because one of the reasons that we have a problem with global warming is that we have an economic system that makes the price of petroleum products too inexpensive. And until we deal with that problem, we won't be able to deal with global warming. So one critical thing to do is to start looking at the world from a systems perspective. Now, the second point, I'm sure everyone knows Albert Einstein's famous quote, "You can't solve a problem with the same mind that created it." one of the very unusual positions that we used to have at Seventh Generation, although this guy got fired along with me. His title was Director of Higher Consciousness. And you would think, why would a business have a person in charge of higher consciousness? I mean, that sounds, almost a little silly. But the truth is that the challenges that we face have a lot to do with our consciousness. And I don't mean that just in the sense of meditation or spirituality. We live our lives often replicating the same patterns and processes that we lived yesterday and the day before. We tend to do the same things over and over and over again. We ask the same questions. And it is scary to me how much of our life is a pattern that we repeat over and over again. And when I say higher conscious, I mean watching yourself. Are you doing what you want to do? Are you changing the things in your life, asking the questions, meeting the challenges that you want to change? And you have to, in a sense, watch yourself and be more intentional about what it is you want to accomplish and who you want to do. The next thing I want to talk about is the challenge that is related to systems thinking, which is siloed interests. We have today 2 million, take or plus or minus a few, nonprofit NGOs around the world. All of these organizations are trying to solve the world's problems. And at the same time that they're trying to solve the world's problems, they're competing with each other. They're competing with each other for resources, for money, for talent. And one of the most fundamental challenges that we face today is by seeing where we have common interests that need to rise above the individual interests of our organization or the group that we're involved with. One of the amazing accomplishments, this organization that you heard about called the American Sustainable Business Council, which is less than 2 years old. How could you possibly get 65,000 businesses to join an organization in such a short amount of time? In part because it's an organization of organizations. But the most important lesson that we have talked about is that, yes, this group cares about global warming, and this group cares about tax reform, and this group cares about energy policy. But one of the things that these businesses have discovered is that if they can't work together on an issue, their likelihood to succeed on their own issue is dramatically diminished. So what has been amazing is to see all of these businesses willing to work together on a common agenda. And that agenda is an unusual agenda. We were the only business group that was against continuing the tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans. And you know what? It's meaningful when 65,000 businesses say it's not necessary for the wealthiest Americans to continue to get the benefit of this tax cut. It means something different than when the environmental groups or the labor movement says it. So we have been a powerful force in a short amount of time. And we've met with the White House. We were at the Secretary of Labor's office last week. The government is eager to have and hear this other perspective of business, in spite of the fact that the Chamber of Commerce, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, spends $200 million a year, and that is tough to compete with. So the next thing I want to talk about is something that I alluded to earlier. One of the things that concerns me about business is that most businesses are organized where you've got all these employees, and then you have shareholders and investors who invest in the business. The vast majority of the value that is created goes to the investors. A small amount goes to the employees. And I think that one of the fundamental changes that we need to make in our economy is we need to have more businesses where employees are owners. Research pretty much across the board will tell you that businesses where employees are owners perform better than businesses where they're not owners. And it sort of makes sense. I mean, if you go to work and it is your business, you might think differently about safety issues or health issues or wasting money. And the statistics show that those businesses tend to do better. And those businesses exist in our society in pretty significant ways. We have thousands and thousands of co-ops. We have thousands of ESOPs. We have community loan funds. We have credit unions. And I think this is a very healthy part of our economy that we need to grow because it creates a very different type of employment. And one of the most exciting things that is happening, how many people, I ask these questions, but are familiar with Mondragon in Spain? Same group over here knows the answers to all the questions. But Mondragon, which is 50 or 60 years old, is a group of about 1,000 companies, all of whom are worker-owned cooperatives. And they have grown very, very significantly over the past 50 or 60 years. They have their own bank that finances their own businesses, their own insurance company that provides insurance. And people within the Mondragon cooperative tend to support businesses that are part of the cooperative. That model is now being imported into the United States. And in Cleveland, there's something called the Evergreen Project. And they've done something that's really interesting. Now, Cleveland has lost 50% of its population over the last decade. Large parts of the city have unemployment rates that are about 40%. And no one has really figured out how to turn around cities that are in that state of decline. But the mayor of the city, together with the Cleveland Foundation and some of other university, went over, visited Mondragon, and they said, well, what if the primary institutions like this one supported local businesses that were cooperatively organized to create jobs in our community? So the hospital said, well, we're going to direct all of our laundry needs to support a green, cooperatively owned laundry. And we're going to buy food from a local greenhouse. And the biggest risk that small business faces, in my opinion, is the uncertainty of whether they'll be able to generate revenue. That uncertainty about revenue generation is, I think, the largest challenge that business faces. But by getting the institutions in the community to guarantee that revenue stream, these businesses were able to organize and begin to operate successfully. There's probably 50 cities around the country that are looking at that model. There's a project to start this in the South Bronx. And I think that these are the types of solutions we need. It's not just about looking at green products. It's about looking at ownership. It's about looking at things like import substitution, where instead of buying services from people, companies outside our community, we're supporting our own community. We're creating vibrancy, health, sustainability in the community in which we live. So those are very exciting opportunities. And these are sort of holistic systems. I mean, they understand in Cleveland, as they do in Mondragon, that they have to train people to be entrepreneurs. They have to train people to think about business and being business owners rather than just being employees. So those are some very helpful examples. And just, let's see. Let me stop there and take questions. And the questions can be on the subjects I've been talking about or not, if you have an interest that is not related to where I have focused. I have probably never been asked a question that I was unwilling to answer, so you should feel free to pretty much ask me anything. So who has a question? Yes.
My question is, in any discussion of sustainability, and this is somewhat off topic, but my question is, in any discussion of sustainability, at least on a large scale, I feel like there's an elephant in the room because these externalities that are produced in the systems we have are normally related, either directly or indirectly, to the population. So I'm just curious, I feel like it's a very stigmatized topic to discuss, but what are your feelings on population control? Should any mind set be made where it's irresponsible if you have 10 kids, or is that not an issue right now?
Yeah. No, population is a critical topic to talk about, and it is not off topic. It's central and should be central to any discussion about sustainability. But I think about population a little differently. I don't think it's about telling people it's unethical to have 10 kids, because most of the research shows that as education rises, families tend, on average, to have less children. And there's some fascinating studies in Bangladesh where the Grameen Bank is operated. And what they found is that there is a tendency to want to have a lot of kids because they're people to take care of you and they're people to generate income for you. I look forward to that myself. But as education levels rise, families get smaller. And I think that rather than a moral or an ethical approach to say, don't have more kids, what we need to do is make sure that we're focusing on education and also, honestly, empowering women to make decisions, not just men. One of the amazing things about the Grameen Bank is in Bangladesh, anybody can get a loan as long as you're a woman. Generally speaking, they don't do much lending to men because they feel that there's higher risks in lending to men. Men have a greater propensity to spend money on alcohol and drugs and other bad things. And amazingly, when the Grameen Bank got into the mortgage business, they only gave mortgages to women who could own the houses and not men. But it's a relevant issue. If you haven't read Jonathan Franzen's book, Freedom, which is one of the best novels I've read in the past few years, the issue of population and the environment is at the center of that book. Another question, great question, thank you.
I have another question.
Let me come back. I think there's a gentleman behind you.
Hi, my name is Ali. I'm an MBA student in the second year here. I'm curious, and you can choose not to answer this question if you don't want to, but what prompted you to leave Seventh Generation after spending so much time and investing so much into the business there?
You mean, well, again, leave, I mean, I stepped down as CEO, but then later I was fired, so it wasn't of my choosing. I stepped down as CEO because I felt that it was time for me to focus more of my attention outside the company. And I must say, as painful and uncomfortable as being fired is, it has forced me to ask a difficult question, which is, okay, now that I get to start all over again, what am I going to do with the rest of my life, and where will I have the greatest impact? But the reason that I stepped down and the reason that I am in some ways looking forward to this transition goes back to this question of, do you want to put your energy into being an exception to the rule, or do you want to change the rules? And my conclusion is that I want to dedicate the rest of my life to changing the rules for all business and for society, rather than being an exception to those rules. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I sort of have a follow-up to that. So you were the CEO of Seventh Generation, and then you said that there were certain differences in the values that caused you to sort of make some of those changes, step down. And so what is it that you think you might have done differently as CEO that could have presented those conflicting values to sort of...
Yeah. So, there's some real lessons that come out of this, and one of them is that governance really matters. If I start another company, which I am likely to do, I will limit the scope of influence of investors, whether they like it or not. If they want to invest, whether it's by having a second class of stock that has a supermajority voting, or whether it's through governance. Many of the values of the company were not embedded in the governance of the company. So the salary caps, the GRI reporting, the radical transparency, I think need to be part of the governance. And B Corp does some of that, but not all of it. And if you have a company where there's a significant amount of employee ownership and you need an 80 or 90% vote to change some of these things, you have some protection that those values will live on and won't be subject to the decision of just the majority, which often tends to be financial investors.
Thank you.
Yeah. Other questions? Yes.
Hi, my name is Justin Asuncion, and I am in the undergraduate finance program. And you spoke a little bit about government subsidies, specifically for oil. And I'm of the opinion that the government does that because essentially us as the population wants that. So right now gas is at, I guess, $3 a gallon. So without those subsidies, say that gas would go up to $7, $8 a gallon. What would be your suggestions for getting the public to accept that? And how would you go about getting rid of these government subsidies?
Yeah. Well, I think gas should be $6, $7, $8 a gallon. If you go to Europe, where gasoline is 2 to 3 times as expensive as it is here, you don't see people driving the kind of cars that we drive in this country because it's just simply too expensive to do. Higher gasoline prices are a hugely effective way to impact behavior. All of a sudden, when gasoline is so expensive, people are more likely to think about using their bicycle or taking public transportation. There is one negative to high fuel prices, and that is it is in effect a regressive tax. When fuel prices go up, they are the most painful to low-income people, and that is the single critical thing that you have to offset. You have to make sure that you offset that burden to lower-income people when gas prices go up. But one of the reasons that we've had such trouble with solar technology and wind technology is it can't compete with the subsidies that go into the petroleum-based industries. And just to give you an example, in Europe, where there is a market for carbon, CO2 is priced, the price fluctuates often between $10 and $20 a ton. So you're going to emit CO2, there's a price attached to that. If coal companies in the US had to pay $1, just $1 for every ton of coal they emitted, every coal company in the United States would be losing money. So we have a whole industry that is built upon and can't tolerate those costs. If you look at it from an employment perspective, where are you going to create more employment? Building a nuclear power plant, a coal facility, creates a fraction of the employment that something like energy efficiency does, that tends to create about 10 times as many jobs. So for me, it's hard to argue whether it's from an employment perspective, an environmental perspective, that the subsidies that the oil industry gets are good in the long term for our economy. I think they're slowing a transition that we need to make in our economy down, and we can't afford that. The price is going to be too high. Yes?
Yes.
Oh, so you'll be next.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Question is, how can we compete in this country when there's such an imbalance of regulation around the world in a global economy. Businesses here are heavily regulated and face virtually no regulation in many places around the country.
So give me just an example of a regulation that you think is hindering business in America.
Well, I'm just looking at it from the standpoint you gave the solar panel company example. We've had, of course, many other companies outsourced to China and India, where the imbalance of regulation from the United States compared to China and India is many orders of magnitude, if it really exists. And so you talk about, we need more owners here. We clearly do, but the labor, how do we compete here in a global economy?
So I'm going to answer that, but I want to give me two regulations you would like to see taken off the backs of business.
Well, I'm not talking about taking regulations off here in the United States, but how do we make them equal around the globe so we're competing on the same playing field?
I think it's unlikely that we will ever have standard regulations around the world. And I think we need to think differently about how to compete than dealing with regulations. I think that the way we need to compete in this country is we need an economic strategy that thinks about the reality that you can't be good at everything. So what are you going to be great at? The Chinese have said, we're going to be great at alternative energy. We're going to spend more money than anyone in the world buying, building, developing alternative energy, whether it's batteries, solar powers, or wind turbines. What do? They integrate that in a vertical way throughout society. They build schools that teach people the technology and the capabilities. They invest in business. And we need economic strategy in this country that says America will be a world leader in cellular technology or whatever it is. That then has to flow to the school system. It has to flow to tax and regulatory issues. And we can't be good at everything. And this is my issue with the oil subsidies, is I think that it drags us in the wrong direction. We're in a world that is going to move away from petroleum, but we're spending all of our money keeping an industry that has to die alive rather than investing in the industries of the future. And it will be because we are better innovators, because we create better technology, because we are better at education, that will win. We're never going to be the cheapest labor force. We can't ever compete with the cheapest labor. But there are ways in which we compete, and we have to figure out how, as a country, we have strategic advantage.
How do we protect our innovation? Because a lot of it has gone to other countries, and as you know, has been reverse engineered in no time at all, and then back on the streets here at half the price, with no protection from those countries.
Well, it's tough to be aggressive with China when they can destroy our economy by selling too many of our treasury bills all at once. We've got ourselves into a mess where China is buying up America, and it puts us in an awkward position because we don't deal with the low price of their currency. We don't deal with intellectual property. I think that that's a place where we have to be aggressive. I think that's a standard that we have to enforce. You had a question.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Kate. I'm a third-year law student here. And my question is kind of about subsidies also. I was wondering, you were talking about the oil subsidies and how you think that those would be better if they were $8 a gallon, if they were gone and gas was $8 a gallon. Personally, I agree with you. But in an economy where we have such a high employment, especially in cities like Detroit or other big auto-heavy industry cities, don't you think that a reduction or an elimination of the subsidies in the oil industry would cause even more unemployment in cities that are so reliant on oil industries?
Yep. So you can't do these things overnight. And again, you have to have an economic strategy. So, I think that America as a country has to invest more in mass transportation. When we want to build a high-speed rail system, we buy those rail cars from outside the United States. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So, you never want to move so quickly that what you do is put millions of people out of work. You have to have a plan for a transition. So oil prices or gasoline prices should never go from $3 to $8 all at once. You have to phase that in over time, and you have to look at where you will lose employment. And I'm not sure that necessarily has to come from the auto industry. I mean, the auto industry has rebounded in a way that I think most people thought wouldn't be possible. And I think it's because finally we're building different kinds of cars that are more appropriate to where we're going to go in the future. But these auto companies like GM have also been very successful outside the United States as well as inside the United States. And look, I am not an economist, and I don't want to sound like one, but for me, it does come down to an economic strategy that isn't driven by special interests. It's driven by a set of principles. And what we have now is an economy that is driven by special interests, the people that have the most influence. I mean, when you think about the economic crash, what industry spent more money lobbying than any other industry in the United States? The finance industry. They were spending $500 million lobbying the government. They were getting regulations passed that were bad for the economy. And that special interest allowed for rules and laws to be passed that were bad for our economy. We can't allow any industry to advantage themselves in a way that disadvantages our economy, our country, our workers, our citizens. And, we have a system now where politicians are basically up for sale. They talk about Vermont being one of the cheapest Senate seats in the country because it costs less to get a senator elected in Vermont than other places, and so people will go after those Senate seats. It goes back to, from a systemic perspective, the issue of money in politics. And one of the greatest travesties is the Citizens United decision, which freed companies to spend even more money in the political system than they had in the past. That rule, that was the law that was passed by the Supreme Court, was in part the result of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce investing heavily in promoting a change in that law. And we don't need laws that disempower our citizens. One of the reasons that we have such low voting turnout is because people don't think that their vote matters. They think that they become in some ways disenfranchised from their own democracy. That's a lousy answer to your question, and I will work on a better answer going forward. Yes, I'm looking. Are there people on the sides that I'm missing? Okay.
I'm Liz. I'm in the nonprofit administration program, and I'm extremely aware of the disparity, 1 in 7 families being on food stamps. I help run a couple of the biggest food pantries in this city. I have a pretty depressing outlook, though, and I'm intrigued by your work with some of the large companies like Microsoft and Walmart. They profiteer off of a lot of the low-income, uneducated people that walk the streets of any city these days. The fact that they're talking to you, that those company representatives are talking to you and interested in this, do you actually have hope? What vehicles do Americans have to make some bigger change? Are these CEOs and company execs talking to you because they actually acknowledge that the disparity in income is a big problem in a society? Or is this sort of a token, okay, we'll do something to make us look better, but we'll keep making as much money at such a steep rate as we always have?
Yeah, that's a great question. I I actually believe that these large companies are beginning to come to terms with the fact that this is bad for their business. The inequity in society creates less consumers to buy companies' products. I mean, actually, I was reading an article this morning, and there was an increase in retail sales, and people were saying, well, so the economy's rebounding. And the truth is, when you bake in inflation and you look at where that increase in purchasing coming from, it's mostly from wealthy people, and it's not all across society. Lower and middle income people are buying less. So I think that the challenge that these big companies face is they've built a business model on a system that has these negative effects both on society and the planet, and often they don't know how to get from here to there. For example, I was talking to the senior management at M&M Mars a couple months ago, and they asked me directly what I thought the greatest threat to their business was, and I said, well, you're selling a product that is dangerous for society. We can't afford to take particularly low-income people and let them spend their money on such low-quality calories. It creates obesity, it's bad for our health, and I think that in the next 10 to 20 years, you will face regulations that begin to limit your ability to sell the very product that is the mainstay of what you do. The challenge they face is, well, how do we get from where we are to a different place? And, the truth is, that's where all of you come in. I mean, your biggest opportunity, all of you are here studying business, and what the world needs is you to help these companies figure out how to make the transition from unsustainable, irresponsible, inequitable business models to the business models of the future. It's not often going to come from the senior management of the company. It's going to come from people who think differently, who see the world differently, who are willing to take on different types of challenges. So I am optimistic. I tell you a funny story about Microsoft. They asked me the same question, what's the biggest challenge we face? And I said, well, you write software that makes computers obsolete very quickly. So people create lots of garbage with their electronics because they have to keep buying new computers that have more memory. And I said, I understand why that's good for you, but you've created a business model that's really bad for the world in a lot of ways. But these are tough challenges for companies to deal with. And it really is the opportunity. I mean, business doesn't have people who can make the business case for being more sustainable and being more responsible. It is an incredibly valuable thing, and it's not about going into a company and saying, this is bad, this is unethical, this is immoral. What the company wants to hear is, how can I continue to meet my financial obligations as I become more sustainable and more responsible? And that is often a tough challenge to figure out. So I am optimistic about the authentic and genuine concern at these companies. What worries me is that the pace of change is too slow, is that the rate of change is slowing the rate at which the car is about to crash into the wall and has not turned the car around to drive away from the wall. So that's my experience. Yes.
Hi, my name's Alexandra, and I work for a company that's been in business for over 100 years, and actually I'm here with my colleagues. And we just recently created a sustainability task force. So I know 100 years is a long time, but we might as well start now. It's better late than never. But as you were saying before, I'm just concerned that we're starting this movement within the business that's totally doable. But my worry is that we're going to start creating these challenges and goals and ways to change and be more sustainable. But I'm worried that we're going to be more like the nagging parents than implementing the values that need to be created and established now into the future. So how do we move away from, pointing the finger and saying, you need to do this, you need to do that, but really implement these values instead of a chore?
Well, the values have to be connected to how being sustainable is going to give you a competitive advantage in the marketplace. And, the companies that are the most successful in being sustainable and responsible are companies that have fully integrated those initiatives throughout the business in a way that your customers and consumers appreciate. So, you have to think about it in a little bit. What product or service do you sell?
Essential oils and fragrances and flavors.
Aha. And what's the name of the company?
The Liebermuth Company.
Okay. So, Seventh Generation works with a fragrance company. Do you know which one they work with?
I think they work with 3, right? IFF is one?
Yeah, I don't even know. But this fragrance company pays Seventh Generation money to work with it because it wants to learn about alternatives to synthetic fragrances and how to do it. And we have learned a lot about it. There are, as you know, all kinds of health risks associated with some of the chemicals in synthetic fragrances. There will be regulation coming that deals with some of those chemicals. So you have to make the business case. You have to say, what is the cost going to be if all of a sudden our customers discover that we've got something in our fragrances that is all of a sudden determined to be carcinogenic or dangerous or becomes illegal? But you have to make the business case, and you have to figure out how your knowledge and leadership in natural fragrances is going to give your business a competitive advantage and is going to enable your business to grow and attract new customers and new companies. So you can't, it's not just about recycling, and it's not just about changing light bulbs, and not about, pointing your finger at someone who puts the apple in the, not in the compost bin. It's really a strategic question. And what I would say, though, is I would also encourage you to get some outside help with people that specialize and do this. There's a guy named Tim Greiner at Pure Strategies, and he thinks about these issues, how to integrate sustainable strategy in the business, not just the list of 10 things to do to be more sustainable.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
My name is Forrest. I'm an MBA student. My question is, I know 7 generations give back to society 10% of your profit, and also, as you said, summer products are even more expensive than your competitors. So how you compete with the regular business rivals?
Yep. So, 2 parts of the question. If you have a company that gives away 10% of its profits and makes products that are sometimes more expensive, how do you compete? A couple things are important to think about. First of all, the majority of the increased cost of a lot of natural products has a lot to do with the retailer, not just the manufacturer. So, you have a grocery store that might make a 10 or 15% margin on a regular diaper, but they take a 30 or 40% margin on a natural diaper. So one of the things that you have to do is you have to encourage the retailers to not take such premiums, because when the consumer doesn't have to pay the premium, they will much more often choose the natural product. And the retailer will actually make more money at a lower margin than at those higher margins because of greater velocity. But the biggest competitive advantage that a lot of these companies have is that they develop a very different kind of relationship with the consumer. Consumers, when they purchase from Seventh Generation, are often not just purchasing a paper towel, or they're not just purchasing laundry detergent. They're buying all of the things that Seventh Generation does. They're buying the positive way in which they treat their workers. They're buying the health and safety benefits of the product. I mean, one example is, you buy a cleaning product that has high levels of volatile organic compounds, as you have lots of volatile organic compounds in your fragrances. Those VOCs are often asthma triggers. And so if you have a child that has asthma and you use, let's say you save 25 cents on the cleaning product, but your child has an asthma attack. When you add up the cost of taking half a day off of work, going to the pharmacy, going to the doctor, paying your deductible and your copay, that 25 cents that you saved is actually a terrible deal. So you have to also change the way people think about the products. But I think that ultimately for green products to be successful, they have to be priced at parity with other products. And if you go to some stores like Target, Target has done a great job in pricing a lot of green products at parity with non-green products, and as a result, they've been very successful at selling them. I think that there's a limited population that will pay the extra money for green products.
I tend to think that people really like to talk about sustainability because they're trying to figure out how they can, figure out a solution without changing their actual behavior. And I think it's really hard to make the case to businesses to say, we want you to do these things while we still buy their products as they are today. I think, voting with your dollars is really the most important thing you could do. And I just have the question for you. If you could encourage the American public to boycott, all-out boycott, stop buying ever one product in the market that's common, what would it be?
Well, I'll answer that question in a moment.
But I'll get a product, one.
You're going to get your answer. The reason, and actually the most recent book that I wrote that came out a month ago is Planet Home, and it answers that question, but it answers it room by room of your house, so it tells you what product not to buy in each room. But let me step back from that because your question suggests two things that are really important. First of all, the problem that we face is not just the company. Every morning when I get up and I look in the mirror, I have to remember that I am part of the problem as well, because it is a lot of bad decisions that I make as a consumer that propel and continue things to be the same way. I was just thinking recently about my addiction to Amazon. We live in a teeny little town, so first I bought books from Amazon, but then I started buying pasta, and I started buying coffee, and I started buying vitamins. And I realized, what I'm doing is I'm actually hurting my local economy by not supporting my local businesses and just going to Amazon because it was easy. So the first thing we have to do is realize that, we are all part of the problem and we all have to be part of the solution. The reason that that's a tough question to answer is if I was to answer that question from, let's say, an environmental health and safety perspective, I would say chlorine bleach, because I think that chlorine bleach is such a dangerous chemical. It has no place in anybody's home. But is health and safety more important than labor issues where you have a product that's being made by child labor or a product that's having a negative toll on the environment? And the product that I actually dislike the most is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I think that their product does more damage to our society and our economy than anything else. So what I would do is I would encourage every company you buy from, tell them not to support and be part of the Chamber of Commerce. You don't want the company that you're buying products from to be investing in preventing progress on global warming, to be invested in allowing companies to spend unlimited amounts of money in politics. Right now, I think that they're the single most corrosive force in society. I used to, it's hard to do this product that I really hate. Yeah, I mean, tobacco, that's probably a safer, easier choice in a way. But I think that different products are bad for different reasons, and certainly tobacco has a whole host of terrible things associated with it.
Could I offer my suggestion?
Go for it. Go for it.
I guess in thinking about this, somewhat, I would choose bottled water because I feel like it's the ultimate slap in the consumer's face. We get potable water out of every single faucet in the United States almost, and yet we're sold bottled water for more than gasoline, and people buy it. And I think while we're drinking bottled water running around, how can we expect anything else to change? We're not standing up for ourselves at any level. And I think talking about things without really stopping the action that's causing them, I don't see, everyone's barking and no one's biting. Yeah. And I think that's the real problem.
Yeah. So I'm almost out of time here. So let me just end with a couple of thoughts. One, if this stuff is interesting, go visit my website, which is jeffreyhollander.com. And I write 3 or 4 times a week on my blog on these and other related issues. But just let me end by reinforcing something that I said earlier. As bad as the problems are that we face, we have the ability to deal with them. And to a large extent, how successful we are at dealing with those challenges will largely depend on the path that you all decide to take with your life. How much of your life are you willing to dedicate to dealing with these problems? How much of your income are you willing to sacrifice? Are you going to make a decision about your career by where you're going to get paid the absolute most amount of money? Or are you going to make a decision to go work somewhere with a company, with an organization that will pay you a reasonable salary, but at which you will be able to make a positive contribution to the challenges we face every day? The world needs you. I mean, the truth is the world can't afford to produce business school students that just work at investment banks and consulting firms. We need your talent. We need your wisdom. We need your thinking. We need you to dedicate your lives to addressing these really, really tough problems that we face. So I hope that you'll take that challenge. I hope that when you make the decision about the career you pursue, you think about it holistically and systemically and balance income with your ability to make a positive difference. Thank you very much.
There may be a writing instrument in here. Let me encourage you to write back. Thanks kindly.